Has Alvin Kamara lost his auto start status? And I would say for a contender, is he even startable with Taysom Hill under center? We should say around center in the center vicinity of the Saints offense until Drew Brees is back, whatever that TBD is. Welcome to the Footballguys Dynasty podcast. I'm Chad Parsons, joined by Jordan McNamara. And Jordan, for 2 weeks now, we've had a sample size where Latavius Murray, dare I say, is he the better fit with Taysom Hill? They are running power. They are running ball control. And if Alvin Kamara is going to get 3 targets over 2 weeks, that's his bread and butter. And Murray, is he the better fit for what they're currently running? Brees may be back for week 14, 15, 16. But do we have to completely reassess how we view Alvin Kamara for lineup decisions this week, next week, pivotal weeks?
I mean, it's crazy, right? You got all this way, and this is what you're dealing with as a Kamara, as a GM with Kamara on your team, right? Like he got you this far, and you're like, oh, now we're doing this. It'd be tough to bench him, right? He got a touchdown, he got away with it in week 11. But I will say, I think Latavius Murray is much more, he's a running back 2 probably right now, instead of being a desperation flex. I think he's on that radar. So I would be, it doesn't feel good, but I would be hard pressed. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a running back that you'd feel more comfortable with than Kamara. And especially if you have like multiple flexes and that sort of stuff. I just think ultimately it breaks for Kamara would be my thought, but it is, I mean, how crazy was the start and now we're here, right? I mean, it's just, and right. This is a good example of when people talk about, well, I'm going to push it all in for this year. Like there's a lot of stuff that can happen. And especially in an uncertain year like this, like there's so many things that can happen. And you and I have talked along the way. I have this team that somehow it's like the little engine that could. I just keep finding a way with some other, at quarterback and receiver and tight ends playing really well, but it's like, it's kind of desperation at running back. And it's just, I've just week by week, like sort of hopscotched between guys and Wayne Gallman, and now it's Latavius Murray. And you know what I mean? That is, I think, a plausible strategy with Latavius Murray right now. And it's a really interesting scenario because you get Atlanta, and then you get Philly, and you get Kansas City. Like there should be, I mean, at least Atlanta and Kansas City should be higher scoring, I would think. Maybe they force them into some, Taysom Hill's got to throw it a little bit more, and they're going to have to get Kamara open, but this small sample size hasn't looked great for Kamara right now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to circle back to what you said, which is it's hard to bench him. And I mean, but think of it this way. For teams that are getting Raheem Mostert back, for teams that in week 14, if Brees isn't back and we're into the same construct, they're getting Christian McCaffrey back. We're getting back, and you mentioned that, there's a bunch of injury away guys that are currently seeing spot starts, and maybe by week 14, those are drying up a little bit for you. But I mean, Antonio Gibson sure as heck feels a lot more solid than he did 2 months ago for lineup decisions. So you could easily, and if in a typical format that you're starting 2 or 3 running backs somewhere in that range, I think it's pretty conceivable. Now you're losing Mike Davis on bye, and then McCaffrey coming back. I mean, so there's some moving pieces certainly. And then, Freeman could be coming back week 14 as well to lose Wayne Gallman. But I mean, there's some two-way guys that feel a lot more two-way than Kamara, which is really weird to say because, I mean, he's like one of the preemptive top 2 or 3 guys in the league in that capacity, but it just is drying up completely. So if you say Alvin Kamara, the runner, solely the runner, and, seeing 10 to 15 touches, is that, a top 8, top 10, top 12 start guy? I mean, you almost have to view that in the prism of a 2-down thumper, right? A 2-down guy that is not going to be involved in the passing game in a Nick Chubb capacity, but yet obviously not really the upside because of what that volume is going to look like. You've got a running quarterback that's going to be siphoning away a heck of a lot more than Brees and your typical pocket passer. I have plenty of Kamara shares, and I think there's some scenarios where, I mean, I might start him in half the leagues I have him, and that might be a little robust for week 13 specifically. But because I think Falcons Eagles, they have a really good chance to control both of those games. And we saw with Denver, especially, and Atlanta a couple weeks ago. I mean, they controlled those games. And again, they really don't have to go outside their shell. It's a lot of run, and Hill, frankly, is not a check down guy.
Yeah, I mean, I just keep going back to, you think about, right, how good the start was for Kamara, and how good it was 1.5 warp good. And we were on a 3 warp pace, right, through the end of the season. It was that good, right? It was all time good to start. And now we're talking about not playing him. Right. And
right.
I mean, there's like, it cannot be good for these couple weeks, but I think ultimately, I mean, when it comes down to it, and you have to say, all right, in week 14, am I going to play Wayne Gallman, or am I going to play Alvin Kamara, right? Or am I going to play, when you're getting into that range, that's a tough trigger to pull going the other way. I mean, that is just, it's tough, right? And I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope we get Breeze back, and that's what we're looking for. But it's a really tough scenario with Kamara in this situation. But I think it's found money where you have Latavius Murray, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And actually, Footballguys this week has 16, 17 points for Kamara, so that's low running back 1, high running back 2, which obviously is a full tier or 2 down from where you would project him, on a typical Saints week with Breeze and everything else in place. So again, it sounds like it's probably a little closer to your side than my side of the argument in terms of the Footballguys early on staff projection for this week, which it's also pretty interesting that we still have a game in front of us. I think this is the first time we recorded once in our Footballguys show Lifeline here of having a Tuesday night game. So that has occurred once while we were recording, and now we have a Wednesday afternoon game, which is throwing waiver wires across the landscape into a spin cycle for what they're going to do. Are we pushing it to Thursday? I love the ambiguous. Well, some leagues will just be going at some point in time after the game ends. So that's nice to nice to know for people that may have no waiver dollars left. It's like, we're going to do. You're relying on first come first serve and getting on there in a timely fashion, but you'll never really know when it's happening. That's always nice. That's almost like saying, yeah, at some point in the middle of the night, I'm going to scream like I'm being shot. Oh, thanks. Thanks for the heads up on that. Good to know. Glad to know I can go to sleep, rest easy, that it'll be at 2:30 a.m. or any time. Yeah, so that was one of the bigger ones in terms of Alvin Kamara, in terms of here's where we are. And maybe the biggest adaptation here is Latavius Murray. You feel a lot better about him, and not just as a injury away, could change your season, change your week player, but actually independently viable a la Kareem Hunt.
Isn't this a weird situation? You go back to actually Mark Ingram, where the two of them were viable, and then when he was a Saint, and then he leaves, they bring in Latavius Murray, and the narrative on Murray was, hey, that's going to be the same situation. Murray's going to be viable. Then he's not at the beginning of the season. Everyone sort of fades him. He has that huge week, that huge 2-week stretch where he was running back 1 when Kamara was out last year, and then sort of fades back away. And now we're back almost a full 2 years later to what the narrative was on him coming in, that it's going to be not necessarily a committee, but it's going to be a 2-back backfield with him seeing touches. And now you have 2 weeks in a row where he is the majority, or he has the higher touch number, right? So I think it's an interesting cycle. And I was funny because last week I mentioned I said we only get to see these guys on game day, right? So Sunday or Monday or Thursday or Tuesday this year. We're getting Saturday and Wednesday this year. So I think the only day we have not had an NFL game is Friday.
Still time. Still hope.
Yeah, maybe we can slot something in on. I guess Christmas actually falls on a Friday this year, so maybe we can work on that. But I wouldn't rule it out, is what I would say.
So a big dynasty point that was, redraft and dynasty blended together because we're talking lineups and we're talking the next few weeks specifically. And that's certainly a big one, big one for consideration. But here's a macro point that I wanted to ask you about that we've had, and it seems like it's been in cycles. So let's rewind all the way to September. We had CeeDee Lamb as the dynasty wide receiver one. We oscillated to, Jerry Jeudy, T Higgins. Brandon Ayuk had his claim. That we've had weeks where Justin Jefferson has a big game, and now he should be, that anointed rookie wide receiver that should be right up there and maybe a round one startup pick and the first one off the board. You shouldn't be surprised. DK Metcalf certainly has an argument there. And then you have what I call the old guard. You have the guys who are 26 plus, 27, 28 of they've been there, they've done that. And I'm speaking to a guy who is very profile based. Now, you can have a profile. You can be building a profile as a rookie, but certainly you cannot have a full length, page long. I'm applying for a major job. You can't really have, babysitter, 2016 through 2018 for the Thompsons. And it's like, I did some tutoring, with some kid in fourth grade. And so, you can't be building that is a rookie year sort of profile. It's like, that's very nice. That's very nice. But you're applying to be, the associate, director of finance at, such and such. That's not applicable here. So you have guys like Hopkins and Adams and Michael Thomas, even, Tyreek Hill. We'll call him part of the old guard. He's going to be turning 27 in the offseason. Even Allen Robinson, Mike Evans. I mean, you've got guys, Keenan Allen, you've got guys that have been building their profile. And again, some of those guys, they're not going to come close to being round one or round two consideration anymore for startups. But where do you kind of side on the, these guys aren't dead yet, let's stop discounting them heavily years before it's really applicable. And you know what? I'm drafted for my team. Some of these guys, I don't really care if 11 other teams in my league aren't going to pay me handsomely for the player. I'm using them. So that's the most, you actually said, I live in my house. So what do I care what it's worth? I'm not moving. It's some people incessantly check. You're like, I don't check. Why? Because I'm living here. I need a place to stay. And I kind of like it. But so do you kind of use that sometimes as there's two different ways to look at building your team through a startup draft? I mean, a blend of, I like one or two of those younger players, but you combine that with one or two of the older guys, and they're, now we're cooking with something in terms of, who should go where. Are these guys too old? Are the producers too old, and have the young guys not done enough?
I think it's going to be that entire debate is going to create a fascinating startup draft. I mean, I'm really interested in getting in early.
Every single one of them, right?
Yeah, because it's going to be
all January startup drafts.
It's going to be all over the place. I mean, all over the place, and you're going to have a lot of. It's going to be kind of like one of those pick your own adventure books, like where when you were younger, you would pick option A and it would go to page 65, right? Like one of those deals. I absolutely think it's going to be that way this year. There's a lot of, I think at a lot of different positions too, right? There's a lot of different profiles that you can either say, all right, I'm in on this type of profile and can build around it, right? Young, productive, or you can go with sort of the older, more established, higher end guys, right? And or make a mix between them, right? I think it's interesting, and I think largely you can look at players in two spheres, and there's some overlap, right? On one hand, it's production based, right? And that is really, what do you expect them to produce, right? And that's basically one vision that you look through a player. The other one is, what do you expect their value to be? For me, only really early in a startup draft do I care about the value. And the reason for that is a couple of fold. One thing I would say, when people chase value, right? When they chase, I need to insulate value. You're caring about what 11 other owners or 11 other GMs in your league think about, right? And so a good example is like you and I will think that Mike Evans is probably going to be undervalued from now until he's like out of the league would kind of be my thought, right? Until
he's on pace for that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and there's other guys, right? And we could list them off, right? We could do an all undervalued show. And if your thought is, well, I can't, I don't want to be in on him because his value is not ever going to uptick, or he's a falling value player, then you're missing the opportunity at a discount, right? I mean, those things are trying to buy low or trying to get, discounts or favorable profiles at a cheap price or arbitrage and all these things we talk about. If you're trying to capture attractive market value pieces, or, hey, I think this player might go up, you can't really be in on the discount profiles, right? And that's one of the things that I think that's missed, is that I think folks too much care about, hey, we have a phrase for it, sexy roster syndrome, right? How much will other people care about my roster? How much will people think about my roster?
When I post it on Twitter, or when other league mates see it in the off season, how excited and envious will they be?
Right. And I'll tell you, one player that no one cared about, two players that no one cared about in the off season. I had hundreds of trade negotiations. You know who was never asked about? Mike Davis. You know who else was never asked about? Giovanni Bernard. And those guys are getting us through now, right? I mean, and so that's a classic case of
Wayne Gallman.
Wayne Gallman, right? And that happens every year. And so we build rosters that are highly effective for in season, and right, we sort of are building for production, right? And there's a case to be made for, hey, I need insulation, especially early in a startup draft. I don't want to draft a bunch of declining assets, because if I'm not right, then I'm in a lot of, I'm in an illiquid situation. I'm in a lot of trouble there. I get that, but sort of as you go along in existing leagues, I think we get too worked up about market value and what future value is going to be. And it's so fickle. And it's actually, a lot of it is just based on how productive a player is. We'll track it, right? I did some research a couple of years ago, and it was just 50% of the market value of a player was explained by last year's final season points, right? And that's a pretty, for lack of a better phrase, that's a pretty dumb number, right? It doesn't factor in how many games were played. It doesn't factor in, the efficiencies or, anything like that. Half of the value was just on last year's points, right? And that was actually more significant than points per game, right? So when you sort of look at those things, I think,
what does that mean? It means the injured player's underrated is typically what that means too. And that's sort of a known thing in, I would say, second level Dynasty GM management circles, is the injured guy. Like, always explore that angle, whether it's Barkley or, Michael Thomas was hurt for a stretch, or players like that, or Christian McCaffrey the week later, explore those angles, because typically that's the best crack you ever get on players like that.
Yeah. And so I think chasing that, right? Chasing the value, or chasing, you just hit it, right? The market overcorrects and devalues these guys. Well, how do you build a successful strategy where you're trying to chase something that's attractive to a market that's actually acting irrationally?
To other people. Well, that's the other thing. It's like, you're building your team or you're building someone else's team.
Right.
And that's honestly, and that's something 5 years ago I had to I've been evolving beyond that, or maturing past that, of like, always chasing the guy that's going to break out, where why don't you have some guys that you don't have to worry if they're going to break out? Right. Like, wouldn't that be nice? Like, and again, it doesn't have to be your whole roster. I mean, obviously you can sort of do that in redraft and the repercussions are minimal, because draft a bunch of old guys if you want. There's no problem with that, because you're on a 1 year, a 16 week timeline. But Dynasty does work differently. But yeah, like you're working on off of someone else's play sheet, and that's why if the whole league is like, oh wow, great value on that guy, it's like, I mean, is that the point? Is that the goal? Because looking through the prism, I'm setting my lineups as well. So you need a blend of, you can have your rising guys, you can have your favorite up and comers, and that's great. But if you build your whole roster around that premise, you're going to have some flame outs. And then when you get to September, October, November, it's going to be like, well, who's going to butter that bread for you? I mean, it's time to win games.
Yeah. And I'm actually looking at some value profiles for an off-season project. And I'll just say I don't think that there's, in terms of like chasing value profiles, I don't think that the market, I think the market's actually pretty good about it. I think we've identified a couple of spots. Like you said, some of the running back angles, they're there, and they're undervalued. And I think largely like Julio, and I've comped Julio, right? Julio is my 97 Grand Am. And I've used this analogy before, right? When I was just out of school and still waiting tables, living in my grandmother's basement, I had a 97 Grand Am that had 191,000 miles on it, right? It wouldn't have sold for $500, right? But to me, it was invaluable because I couldn't afford another car, right? So I drove it essentially till the muffler fell off, and it sounded like there had been an explosion. But to me, that it was exceedingly valuable, right? Because I didn't have other options. And so, right, I wasn't in the market to sell, right? It didn't matter what it was worth because I was just going to use it until quite literally the parts fell off, right? And for a guy like Julio, at this point, he has gotten to, right, you're going to sell him at a discount, right? You're probably going to sell him, right? If you're going to sell for rookie picks, you're going to sell for a rookie pick that is going after him in startup drafts at this point. And that just seems like a losing value, right? And we know that when you comp guys that have done it to guys that have not done it, you take the guy that has done it, right? So you're now putting yourself at a disadvantage, right? And you're going to what end, right? And I was joking earlier in the offseason, right? People were like, oh, you got to have, you take high value players so that way you can trade them. I said, what? So you can trade them for my productive ones, right? I mean, is that what, right? What's my always question about people that want to build high value rosters is to what end, right? You want attractive pieces. Why? So that way you can trade them to me, apparently, for productive players. Plus, I think would be the answer. But I don't know. I have a hard time. And the other thing too is that we see this a lot, and you'll see it in drafts where you'll see a guy falling, right? And it might make sense in sort of a grand scope of Dynasty where you're playing, 10, 15, 20, 50 leagues, right? Where you see a guy fall, and you hear this in best ball drafts a lot, which is you see a guy fall and you just have to take the value because from a portfolio perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's a lot tougher in a dynasty league to actually extract that profit because 11 other GMs in your league have all passed on the guy, right?
So why would they pay up 6 months after that when they all collectively passed 1, 2, 3 times over what maybe they should, or what you would think would happen in your quote unquote average draft?
Yeah. And so again, so that you see that and you say, well, I can turn around and flip him, right? Or my favorite is when you get multiple pieces in a trade and you get sort of like a generic offer, and everyone, and you see it, and well, maybe I could flip this piece over. Well, if you're getting that generic offer and it's still in your inbox, it probably tells you that it should tell you information, which is that offer, which is probably offered to other people in the league, that type of offer where that type of player, or that specific player, I should say, has been offered around the league and no one's taking it, right? So that tells you that, hey, maybe it's a little bit softer of a market on that player that I'm going to try and turn back over, right? And so again, I just think trying to chase those values, right, in a perfect world, right, in a super efficient market, it might make sense, but when you get into a league, that those efficiencies aren't in play, right, as much, and you get people with attachment and all the other biases that we see. It's really tough to play that value game, and I think it's really tough. And I think people would, if you honestly looked at it, that you wouldn't be able to predict it as well as you think you could, would sort of be the conclusion that I'd reach from a lot of my research.
Yeah, I think, and one thing to distill something you said in there and hit it one other time is the whole getting a share of a player, whether it's in a startup draft, a rookie draft, or as a secondary piece of a trade, that getting that with the intention of I'm flipping it, Like that can't be your primary focus. You can always say with any player or any asset, when the opportunity presents itself, I'm open to selling. And you should always be open to selling any player on your roster, regardless of how high or low you are on a player. But the whole premise of you draft somebody at 306 in your rookie draft, and your intent is, well, I think I'm going to be able to flip them for more than I can flip the pick. Very dangerous game. And like the scenario you said, where you get an ancillary piece of a deal and you sit there and you're like, I don't love the player, and I'll just look to trade this now, or trade it in a few weeks if you're in season, or I'll look to trade it before the season starts or whatever. And a lot of times, like you said, if they have been shopping that player or that package or that construction of it around the league, and you are the one that takes it, I'm not going to say take the bait, but you're the one that takes on that secondary piece. What do we always say? You can't start them, you can't cut them, you're just kind of stuck with them. So if it's that type of player, but you're like, well, I can flip them for something. I can at least go fourth to third or third round pick or whatever it is. But you know what? Like the league probably isn't interested. We know that GM isn't interested. They bailed. So now you're down to 10. And if they've shopped them at all, which they maybe have, and now they've actually utilized a good strategy, which is added them onto an existing deal to shed that roster spot and that albatross, to your roster, now you're stuck with them, and it's your problem. And now you're going to be looking always to bail. And I always talk about there's 1 or 2 or 3 instances in a startup or rookie draft over the years that I've had where you draft a player with, let's call it, ill intentions. Ill intentions means it's like, oh, well, they're just handing me this player way later, not on my target list, whatever. And I find that gets you in trouble, and if it happens a lot, that's obviously something you very much need to correct, because if it doesn't happen very often, you got to say, I have to just be stringent. You just have to have so much granular control over, this is the small subset of what I'm doing. And if that's not a startup draft, and you're like, well, this guy's falling. And what we always say is, well, when in doubt, right? You can just take a rookie pick slot, if you're sitting there in January, February, March. And so if nothing stands out, you've tried to trade and there's maybe one glaring player and you're like, oh, but you really think they're a falling knife, if the league is ignoring them at large, just take the pick. Because then you're just giving yourself an out and saying, well, now I won't decide. Like, it seems like if I decide I should be taking this, or you can just move to your next target player. Even if that's, it's quote unquote early, but at least you're drafting your own roster. You're drafting your own team, because when you start drafting for the market, you start drafting with the intention to trade. You start drafting because you feel the league is handing you something, whether it's startup, rookie draft. And again, trading, that's why I always, even if I like a deal, if there's a part of the deal I don't like, a player, I'd rather pivot that to a pick that is maybe decently lower than that player in the marketplace, because I don't have to deal with trying to trade them for that pick. I just get the pick. Or let me shift to an injury away running back. Let me shift to someone I actually like, even if it's deemed market-wise it's less valuable. I think all those are better, because all of a sudden now you're operating within your own universe of player value and what you deem important for your own your own cupboard of picks and players, as opposed to you do the other way. And I think it creates problems. And I think more GMs out there do it more times than they would admit, of just like, well, I like the deal. Well, pivot what you don't like out of it if you can. And even if it's just shifting a position, even if it's quote unquote going down, I think you'd be far healthier. And it creates, like, what do they always say? It's like, if you give someone, what's the analogy? When you give someone a present, the thing is, where they say you give someone a gift card, well, it's like, now you just gave me an errand. Like now I need to go, like, well, and you used to have to go to the store. See, that was the thing. Like now you can just use it online or whatever. But like you actually gave, you gave somebody like a sweater and you gave them the receipt. Well, now they have to go shopping on their own. Like now they have to go return it, get the store credit or whatever. Now pick out something else. Like, so you basically just give someone a to-do list item. Which is just like, so that was always how it was back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, whatever, of like a comedy routine. But it reminds me of that when you add something onto a Dynasty trade, that like you're just giving me stuff to do because I have to take on player X and I don't even like him.
Yeah, and I think that That actually dovetails into, you mentioned something that was interesting, is that you sort of your progression as a Dynasty GM. And I think a lot of those things, I think that transition from some of that value-based stuff to more production profile stuff is one thing that we've talked a lot about. For me, sort of dovetailing off of what you just talked about at the end, one thing that I have done a lot of is really distill down a draft plan where, people joke, what do you bring to a draft? And my response is an index card, right? Because I sort of know in a rookie draft, like it's going to be this, then that, then this, then that. And that's the plan, right? And that has got away from a lot of the problems that you said, where you're sort of dealing in a lot of these different ancillary players, then you have a tough time with valuing them. That has been something that I've really seen has been successful in terms of actually limiting your universe of players. And if there's an egregious outlying value, then pounce on it. But by and large, it should be a focused group of trying to get your target players. And it's honestly shouldn't be that big of a list. Like we were talking about last week with quarterbacks, like, and a super flex draft, like it's only probably going to be maybe 10 guys that are sort of in my universe of at their cost, I'm interested. And that instead of trying to like chase ADP and everything, because you want to stab with value, beyond the fact that it's just a much easier mental exercise and not as complicated, it definitely streamlines the process, and I think makes decisions better.
What do you think of this? Use the word dovetail. Something I was thinking of while you were talking is, what do you think about this? What if you have, as a Dynasty analyst, instead of having, now again, I do a rookie big board that's like 100 players long. I'm pretty much including everybody because people will have questions about any which player, about where do you have them? And I mean, but we've talked before about if you have them a little bit above or below of where they're kind of typically going or valued, it doesn't matter by how far. I mean, that's the recommendation. You can highlight them in green, highlight them in red, and boom, boom, boom. There's sort of your draft plan or your anti-draft plan. But what do you think about doing the NFL method of, let's say, there's 60, 65 players for a typical, 4 or 5 round rookie draft that's quote unquote viable or like possible to select, or you might see over 10, 20 drafts. These are the players that will be picked at least once. So let's say that's your population of players. But what do you think about the NFL plan where they have 250 something picks, yet a lot of boards might have 75 or 100 players on it? What do you think? Do you think that would be frowned upon in the Dynasty space? Or do you think it would be, wow, like this is actually the way it should be? If you just have a draft board, but there's far fewer players on it than picks in the draft. If you have a 4 round, so 48 player draft, what if your board only had 20 players on it, 15 players? Would that be like, well, where's all the rest of the players? Like you basically had a player and a general range or price point, but you had them, like you said, boom, boom, boom. Here's the target players, and here's the order in which I would take them, which means once these 3 guys are gone, here would be the next guy. Like you don't even really need to ask me. Like that's the next guy. And then here's the 5th guy. Here's the 6th guy. But the 6th guy might be in the early 2nd round in terms of here's the values I like, here's the general ordering, but I'm taking away all the fluff on all the guys that I wouldn't take. And even if they fall a little bit, I wouldn't take them because they're not one of mine. They're not one of my targets. Do you think that would be frowned upon, or are we still operating in 2020 into 2021 of you need to actually rank every single player?
I don't.
Not personally for us. I mean, I know we can walk into our drafts and have like 9 guys we're interested in, and that's fine. But like distilling information for others, do you think that's something that like they need to see every player?
I don't. I mean, I put together a rookie board this year and shared it, and it was. I did it simply. I took a different take on it, right? Because I think to put everyone in a list, I think that's really tough to conceptualize for a lot of reasons. Like positional stuff is hard. So I actually incorporated some metrics, data nerd, and put together a board. And I actually did ranges, right? So I did like top 3 picks. So I did, who I would consider in the first 3 picks of the draft, and then who I would pick in 4 through 6, and then who I would be interested in the back half of the first round. And then I split up the second round into halves, and then third and fourth round. And that kept me really honest, because I could think about, right, like, okay, and this year it turned into being like, all right, it's these 4 or 5 running backs really, and then it's, Taylor was above them, the other ones, and then it was like, okay, the quarterbacks fit in this tier as well, and then after them, it really comes, I'd be comfortable like in the back half of the round with, there's a couple of other running backs in there, I think, and then the wide receivers, and Herbert was actually in that as well, which was, I think, Herbert's going to be a good example of some research that I found. He's going to be a key draft strategy going forward, is what I'll say, in terms of mistakes I made in 2020. But I did that, and it was basically, and that really led me to, it's not all of them in a row. It's like, all right, hey, here are the positions in this range, right? Here's what I'm kind of looking for. And I have them sort of stacked in a specific order. And I would highlight them, right? So I don't think I maybe ranked 30, maybe 35 guys. I definitely didn't rank 50. And I don't think I ranked a third day 3 wide receiver, for example. Like, I just was like, these are guys I'm taking off the board. Largely, I think I should have ranked Gabriel Davis, which was a mistake. But yeah, I mean, I have very much limited it down. I'm not sure the Dynasty community at large is ready for that, but I think you're sort of what you're talking about. I think that's much better. It's made me a better owner. And honestly, because you're sitting on the clock and you're less confused. And how many times have you been there when you were younger? And I mean, this happens this year, right? Where you're like really confused about what to do. And you're really struggling because you've got all these swing thoughts, right? It's like golf. Like, you're standing over the ball and you're like, keep your hands inside, all these things. You're talking to yourself and you're like, I can't even pull the club back, right? That simple process is really, has really clarified it for me and really streamlined it. And I think I make absolutely better decisions because of it.
Yeah. It almost seems like, the longer I go, it's keep it simple. But it's also the what should I do, or what should my thought process or valuation on a player be, or why does that differ from the market? And then, I just said it. And then the why, and then what's the argument for it? And make sure the argument for it is not, doesn't take you 5 minutes to explain, doesn't take 3 paragraphs. Like, it should be a lot quicker than that. But that's really, I mean, the draft board, like, there really should be so much meat there, but yet it needs to be simple. It's like it's an interesting thought process when you ask people, like, what would be the perfect draft board? Like, what would be on it, but also what would not be on it? Like, what would be confusing more than helpful? Things like that. Like, we've talked before about, using tiers instead of just the 1 through whatever ranking systems. And, there's so many moving pieces like that, but we're going to get to draft season. And that's really, and we always say, like, that's fine. You like a player, you don't like a player, but we're going to go back to it over and over and over again, because it's going to be about, well, it depends where they go. Right. I mean, for example, you can, what was that, 2 years ago, where we talked about, you just cannot sit there and take Hakeem Butler, like, in the, what was it, the early second round or whatever. Like, he was quote unquote down from where he was in January, but that's because he went day 3 instead of potentially in the first round, where people were talking or estimating early in the process, or top 50 at minimum. And then he falls to round 4. Well, you got to reassess. So, but at a certain point, Hakeem Butler would be a guy to consider, certainly, but it's not in that range. So that's why it's always a matter of, well, where are they going? I don't like this running back, but if you're telling me he's got a chance to go day 2 and I'm getting him at 307 in March, well, that's interesting to me. It's not interesting if I have to pay 112 and I'm not even sure, he might slide around 5. Like, I just don't have strong confidence in his profile projecting ahead 1 month or 6 weeks or whatever. So those are the types of things. There was a couple of good Dynasty trades I want to go over, because we can talk, obviously putting this into practice of leagues. And yes, some trade deadlines have already passed, but again, I think the forward thinking is, having more leagues that are open to trading to, I would say, at least the start of the playoffs. That's a healthy compromise from the week 10, week 11, where you still have plenty of teams that are sort of jostling and am I in or out? I'm not. And the answer is, I don't know, maybe. So you still
Right.
you still have 2 or 3 games to go, and if you have it, you kick off to week 11. To me, that's too early. You got 11, 12, 13 left in the regular season, and we saw, most seasons you see it, but this year it's been all over the place. I mean, I've had some leagues where it's like only 2 teams were out of it in week 11, and it's like, so you're sitting there and you're 5-5 or 4-6, and it's like, well, I'm in it technically, but if I lose this week, I don't feel in it. So why would I make it? I saw a lot of pause with people making win now, or contender moves versus I'm out of it. I'm willing to sell this and give me something for the off season and next year. And I just saw less of that, and I think it was because I think you got to have week 12, week 13, week 14 as the typical dynasty trade deadline, but that's a different soapbox for a different day that I could certainly go stand on pretty much every day of the week. But here's a trade involving Antonio Gibson. So stock format, Gibson and a third. And this is off the Footballguys Dynasty Trades Forum. So if you want to have if you want to have your Dynasty trade talked about on the show, certainly submit it there, and we'll look through it weekly to get some trades to discuss. Antonio Gibson and a third for TJ Hawkinson, a first and a second, and those are playoff teams.
Stock, huh?
Yeah.
This is choosing between kids because I'm a huge Hawkinson fan, and I like Gibson too.
Now, hold on. Just to clarify this is a personal question. So when you say huge Hawkinson fan, what do you deem too high to have Hawkinson ranked?
I think I have him at like tight end 4.
Okay. Do you think 2 is too high?
I think 2 is too high. Yeah. I mean, then you're putting him over Kelsey, my guess would be, or Kittle. I mean, you'd have to put him over one of those two.
Correct. Over one of them. Correct.
I think I could see a reasonable argument for 3. I'm not sure I would put him over 2. Okay. I don't think I'd put him at 2.
Okay. So 3 would be the reasonable. I'm really, really excited about him. High ranking, you would say. Okay.
Yeah, and I have Andrews ahead of him, but I have him up at 4.
Okay. So you're a big Hawkinson fan, big Gibson fan, and here you go. So they are later. That is a later first in 2021.
Yeah, I think I'd rather, man. Like you look at Gibson's profile, like he's going to probably post a top 12 season as a rookie, and
or 10 or 8.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take Gibson there. Like, I think the warp value is too much. Like, if I was just doing the math on it, right? Like, this is a player that, if he finishes sort of in that, I don't know, let's just call it running back 12 range, sure, right? I mean, that's like 1 or more warp typically in that range. It wins over replacement. And then you sort of look at Hawkinson, if Gibson does that a couple of times, right? Posts a couple of top 24, finishes with something in like the low teens to 10, somewhere in that range, that's going to add up over the picks. I'm typically not a guy that trades first round picks, so I'd like to do this in a different way. Typically,
well, you're mainly just saying I wouldn't trade Gibson for that. You're not saying I would trade that for Gibson. Is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't trade Gibson for that. Is right, and I probably wouldn't. On the flip side of it, like I don't. I think it's a fine value to get Gibson. I probably wouldn't put together those pieces to do it, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, what do we our typical move is, I mean, the move was, target Gibson in rookie drafts, and we're not just getting on some roller coaster. I mean, that was our take. So you got him then. So you're typically not going to get a ton more shares after the price takes off. Right? I mean, you typically don't buy after it screams up, and you already got a decent amount of exposure through rookie drafts. Like, rookie drafts are typically the time where you accumulate the biggest part of your shares, because you do more rookie drafts than you do startup drafts. And, but yeah, so like all of a sudden the price, I mean, this price for Gibson now is what? 2 firsts and a second, basically. And you didn't have to pay that for 204 or whatever. So, so that's the whole, like, so you paid an early second, as opposed to now you're having to pay, a price like this.
Can I ask you a question on a player that we talk about choosing between kids? Was AJ Dillon over Gibson? Was that good? Was that the right process?
Well, we need to go back, and Darius Geis was there.
Mm-hmm.
Adrian Peterson was there, and they got cleared out. So Geis being there, I mean, so was it proper process? Again, I liked both of them. I have plenty of shares of both. And I mean, I would say this for anyone that's sort of hand wringing about Gibson, about Dylan, I haven't seen him much. Like, did you expect to kind of come in without injuries and just run with a job? I mean, I certainly wasn't drafting him with that intention or that runway. So that's it. Again, I thought both went to murky spots. You also had Dylan with a certified workhorse profile and Gibson with I think he can play running back certainly full time in the NFL, but we have not seen it. And that was the big difference between Gibson and say David Johnson or, Dylan or some of these other guys that were clear target players on my board. But it's like with Gibson, you still have that question mark of, Lynn Bowden style. Is he going to be classified as a wide receiver, running back? How is Washington going to do it? We had all it's easy to sit here in November, December and be like, oh, look, yeah, clear workhorse guy. Boy, isn't it great? We also have Alex Smith playing and completely viable. And Dwayne Haskins is already out of sight, out of mind. So much has changed for Washington's football team by this point. I mean, actually back then they were still the, RED skins, right? I mean, so I mean, they have a different name to their team. We have had so much change for that team and offense. So going back and saying we should have just pounded Gibson into the ground over Dylan, in that late first, early second, that was the running back as opposed to having exposure to both. I don't know. That to me is sort of retrospective.
And if you sort of went, I agree with that. If you just flip the scenarios totally and say, all right, Aaron Jones is the one that gets suspended, and Jamal Williams is the one that gets cut, instead of it being Darius Geis getting suspended and Adrian Peterson getting cut in Washington football. Right. If you totally flip that, or if you flip them teams, right, and say Washington takes Dylan instead of Gibson, right? Do we think that the outcome is different, right? I think that if Dylan was given this opportunity, he would be doing the same, if not better. He'd be doing right,
very, very good things. Yes,
right. And so I think it's an interesting. I sort
Gibson
of
would not be
led
playing.
You.
He would not be right. Do we really think he'd be crashing the party for 10 plus touches a week? I would say there's almost zero chance of that.
Right, and I actually think there's some interesting.
He might have been playing wide receiver with some of their injuries this year.
Right. I actually think it's interesting too because you get to a point where, it's a lot of that retro. What you said, where it's a lot of you're looking back at it, and you kind of have to in those decision points, think about what the decision was that you made then, and realize just look at Washington and think about how much things change when people are talking about, immediate producer and, he's going to ride the bet. We have no idea what's going to happen between, we couldn't have conceptualized in the draft of all the stuff that would happen between April and November or December 1st, right? You couldn't have drawn
he might have been playing wide receiver. They're like, boy, That's a nice gadget player. That's a nice offensive weapon, if you will. That's where we were. And it was so you're basically taking Gibson on talent spec and the fact that he was drafted in the early third round on a team where you say, yeah, they got some wide receiver needs, but big picture, they could certainly have running back needs, but you have to draft the player, the pedigree, and the profile. And then all this white noise of situation will figure itself out. And sometimes that takes a while. I mean, so this is you're drafting Alexander Mattison, the profile. We're 2 years basically rolling snake eyes, right? Essentially, to date, you've gotten nothing from him for your team. Right. But what do you draft? But there's so many moving pieces, right? Dalvin Cook could have been a holdout. Dalvin Cook could have been a chronically injured player from what happens if Madison gets to start half of his rookie season full on with Cook out of the picture? What if that had happened this year? And sometimes you roll snake eyes. So right now we're 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way through a season, and AJ Dillon has rolled snake eyes. But again, that's a situational thing. What I would say is, hey, Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams are both slated free agents. The moving pieces to this Green Bay backfield are vast. The permutations of this. So to think that we have this clarified, I just know this. I always go back to doing loads and loads of clicking through Pro Football Reference of looking at depth charts, looking at teams, and when guys actually get chances. A day 2 running back that's not, a satellite player typically, and I said this about Damian Harris in the offseason. I was like, if he goes 2 straight seasons without essentially having a cross-section of clarified 1A opportunity, doesn't mean 1A production, but 1A opportunity, that's a very rare historical setting. And let's say the same thing about AJ Dillon just in advance now and from the offseason. If he goes 2 seasons in a row to start his career as a relatively prototypical, he is, but to lower the threshold here, day 2 guy that doesn't get a good crack at things, that's going to be a historical aberration. So, and again, I think you can say the same thing with that Madison. Now, again, he goes behind a guy that, is one of the best running backs in the league when healthy, asterisk included, and he's stayed healthy for 2 seasons basically. So that's rolling snake eyes, but that doesn't mean the guy can't do it. That's just a rare. You have to use a different set of glasses when you're looking at a player like that, and make sure you're still valuing. What did we say? The profile, the prospect, the talent, the pedigree. Like, you're putting those things together, and not once are you saying situation. And that's a real tough thing when you start going through and you're logging, relatively speaking, zeros in your in your lineups, or they're just sitting on your taxi squad, sitting on your bench. I mean, GMs for Dynasty have different levels of tolerance for that. I drafted said player, and that's why I think Keyshawn Vaughn is going to be fascinating in the offseason, because people, I don't know if people realize that, in my opinion, the most likely depth chart in Tampa Bay is going to be running back 1, Ronald Jones, running back 2, Keyshawn Vaughn. So are you interested in that? Because you shouldn't be bailing for a 3rd round pick if you're interested in that scenario, because I think that's the most likely one. A day 2 running back that isn't at least the primary backup their 2nd season that seems like a chronic bust scenario if you cannot earn that spot when it clears out, with Fournette being a free agent, McCoy will be gone, like, things will be cleared out. And if they bring somebody else in, that's not really a good look for Keyshawn Vaughn if that occurs.
James White.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Oh, you got me on that one. That was good. Just 2 words. James White. Boom. Yeah, he's a free agent. Tom Brady's going to argue for that guy. But Tampa Bay, I mean, again, they're going to do some stuff that's like, we are all in. 2020, 2021. Let's do this. They're going to be, and who knows? It might include things like that. Do you have any final thoughts before we close up here?
No, I mean, I think it's a good conversation. I honestly just keep grinding, right? This season hasn't been easy for a lot of reasons. And I just keep going back to, like, because I had real doubts on, I don't know, what was it? Whenever the Baltimore game got postponed, looked like it was in danger of Tuesday nights. I had real doubts that we were heading, actually over the weekend, I said, I think this is a big time threat. And all I could keep coming back to was Joe Bryant and his optimism about this thing's going to happen. And to steal, and actually Adam Harstead, we joke about needing to start. Yeah, if you have to start 2 running backs for 13 weeks, you need 26 starts, right? The NFL is just trying to get to 256, and they're going to make it happen. And it's just right. And I just kept coming back to those things, thinking, all right, this is where we are. This is where we are. We got to be right. They're going to do this, right? And ultimately, it's good because I had no other options, right? I had to start Roethlisberger. I didn't have another option. Yeah, it was either him or Robert Griffin III, and it didn't much matter because it was the same problem.
Exactly. So can I tell you my biggest sweat for tomorrow's game is a scenario where I got the lead on Monday night with, I can't remember who it was, but I am up by like 0.3 points. And this is with like a bye week on the line. 0.3 points, and guess who they have going? Justice Hill. and with J.K. Dobbins coming back, this is going to be a fun watch. So you got your running back 3 going. Does he have basically a positive carry or 1 catch? And you could be seeing negative game script, but now again, you've got RG3. Like, so how many snaps, like the over under for Justice Hill? Like, I haven't even looked. I mean, does he play even 5 snaps? Because it's this is one of the more fun watches. Like, who cares?
What a break, huh?
But who cares if you? Yeah, and well, if it was on Tuesday, if it was today, wouldn't that have been that Dobbins wouldn't play?
Yeah, Dobbins and Ingram were both not going to play. Now that it's Wednesday, they both can play. All right, so let's see.
Wait, Ingram can play?
Yeah, they both can play. So in games that, so he has 17 total snaps this season. They have all been in the last 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And actually, he's seen an uptick despite Mark Ingram returning. That's notable. 11% last week. So that's interesting. So let's see. Hill has seen how many touches do you think he's seen on the season?
3.
He's seen 1, so he's 1.3 points because he caught a pass for 3 yards.
So if he doubles, his season total, I'm in danger here. What if he
0.3 points?
It's like, yeah, if he gains 3 yards or if he catches 1 pass, pretty much. Like, what if he catches a pass, but it's actually it's actually negative? Or, I don't know. Actually, that can't happen in full PPR. But anyway, I like, who cares about the regular ones where it's like, oh, well, I need Juju to score less than 15, or I need Roethlisberger to score more than 21. Like, these are common ones. I love like the ancillary, like who's the secondary? Like, if you had Devin, man, I need my opponent. Needs 3 points from Devin Duvernay. Like, that's a cool watch. Like, that's one where it's like you're holding your breath the whole game.
Right. Just counting snaps.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that'll do it. Remind you to subscribe, rate, and review the Football Guys shows on all of your podcasting platforms. The Audible, sign up for the Football Guys daily email update delivered from Joe Bryant. We can call him Captain Positive. Love that guy in terms of keeping everyone's spirits. Jordan has needed you this year, and frankly, we all need those words of wisdom and positivity. Just stay with the glass half full, and actually 3/4 full if you can. So that daily email update delivered from Joe Bryant, your daily guide to all of your news and instant analysis. You can sign up. No strings to a subscription, although it's highly recommended. All the things you get from My Football Guys, all of their apps and tools to be able to have your best football and Dynasty season in the rest of this year, plus going on into the future. You can sign up again for that daily email update at footballguys.com/free. So in this episode, we started talking about Alvin Kamara. And of course, it ventures and meanders and had a big discussion about team building your team for yourself, for your own roster, and not so much for the individualized marketplace of your league. Talked a little bit about dynasty trades and player value as well. I am Chad Parsons. He is Jordan McNamara. And until next time, good luck in your dynasty leagues.